In the summer of 2016, an Italian navigator named Claudio Nocelli did something that should have been impossible. He sailed beyond the ice walls of Antarctica and returned with a story that would shake the foundations of everything we think we know about our world. But before we dive into what he found, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why Antarctica is the only continent on Earth that ordinary people cannot freely explore? Why 54 nations signed a treaty, essentially locking it down? Why commercial flights never cross over it, even though it would save fuel and time? And why, despite all our advanced satellite technology, there are still areas of the frozen continent that remain mysteriously blurred or completely censored on every publicly available map? Claudio Nocelli wondered about these things too, and unlike most of us, he decided to find out for himself. Nocelli was not some conspiracy theorist sitting in his basement piecing together theories from grainy YouTube videos. This man had spent over 30 years at sea. He was a professional navigator, a maritime expert who had sailed every major ocean on this planet. His reputation in the international sailing community was impeccable. He understood navigation, weather patterns, ocean currents, and ice formations better than most scientists who study them from behind computer screens. In early 2016, Nocelli began planning an expedition that would either make him famous or make him disappear. He wanted to sail as far south as humanly possible, to test the limits of what we are told about Antarctica, and to see with his own eyes what lies beyond the massive ice formations that surround the continent like a fortress wall. The preparations took months. He knew he would be sailing into some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. The Southern Ocean is notorious for its violent storms, rogue waves that can reach heights of over 100 feet, and temperatures that can freeze a man solid in minutes if he falls overboard. But the physical dangers were only part of what Nocelli was preparing for. He also knew that what he was attempting to do was, in many ways, illegal. Under the Antarctic Treaty system, established in 1959, large portions of Antarctica are off-limits to unauthorized exploration. Military operations are banned, nuclear testing is prohibited, and most importantly for our story, independent expeditions into certain zones require permits that are almost never granted to civilians. The official explanation is environmental protection and scientific preservation, but Nocelli, like many others before him, suspected there might be another reason. He set sail from Ushuaia, Argentina, at the southern tip of South America, in late January of 2016. His vessel was a reinforced sailing yacht, equipped with the best navigation equipment money could buy, enough fuel and supplies for a 3-month journey, and several high-resolution cameras to document everything he would encounter. For the first week, everything went according to plan. He navigated through the Drake Passage, perhaps the most treacherous body of water on the planet, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide in a fury of waves and wind. But Nocelli was experienced, and his vessel was strong. He pushed forward, always heading south, always moving deeper into waters that few private sailors had ever dared to enter. And then he reached them, the ice walls. Now, when most people think of Antarctica, they imagine a continent covered in ice and snow, surrounded by floating icebergs. And that is partially true. But what most people do not realize is that around much of Antarctica's perimeter, there exists a massive, vertical wall of ice that rises anywhere from 30 to 60 feet above the water's surface. In some areas, this wall extends for hundreds of miles without any visible break or passage. Explorer after explorer throughout history has encountered these walls. Captain James Cook, one of the greatest navigators who ever lived, circumnavigated Antarctica in the 1770s and reported being stopped by immense ice barriers that seemed to extend infinitely in both directions. Captain James Clark Ross, in the 1840s, encountered similar walls and described them as resembling the white cliffs of Dover, but made entirely of ice and stretching as far as the eye could see. Roald Amundsen, the first person to reach the South Pole, also documented these ice formations in his journals, noting that they seemed almost unnatural in their scale and uniformity. Every explorer who has ever attempted to penetrate deep into Antarctic waters has encountered these barriers, and most have turned back. But Claudio Nocelli did not turn back. According to his account, He spent days sailing along the ice wall, searching for any opening, any crack, any possible passage through. The wall seemed endless, an unbroken fortress of ice that appeared deliberately constructed to keep people out. His instruments showed strange readings. His compass began behaving erratically. The GPS coordinates started displaying numbers that did not match any known maps. And then, after nearly 2 weeks of searching, he found it. A narrow channel, barely wide enough for his vessel, cutting through the ice wall like a doorway into another world. What happened next is where Claudio Nocelli's story becomes controversial, disputed, attacked by mainstream science, and yet impossible to completely dismiss. He sailed through. On the other side of the ice wall, Nocelli claims he discovered something that should not exist according to every official map and every accepted model of Antarctic geography. He found open ocean, not just a small body of water, but vast expanses of ocean that stretched beyond the horizon. And more incredibly, this ocean was warmer than the frozen waters he had just left behind. His instruments recorded temperature increases of 15 to 20 degrees. The oppressive, bone-chilling cold of the Antarctic waters gave way to conditions that felt almost temperate by comparison. He saw shorelines in the distance, land masses that appeared on none of his charts. He documented unusual atmospheric conditions, strange cloud formations that seemed to generate their own light, and wildlife that had no business existing in what was supposed to be the most hostile environment on Earth. Nocelli took dozens of photographs and hours of video footage. He recorded GPS coordinates that placed him in locations that officially do not exist. He documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who knew that no one would believe him without extraordinary evidence. And he was right not to be believed, at least not by the people who control the narrative about our world. When Claudio Nocelli returned from his expedition and began sharing his findings, the response was swift and predictable. Mainstream scientists dismissed him immediately. His evidence was called fabricated, his photographs labeled as manipulated, and his coordinates declared impossible. Maritime authorities questioned how he obtained permission for his journey. Some suggested he never went as far south as he claimed. Others hinted that the extreme conditions had affected his judgment and perception. But here is what they could not explain away. Nocelli was not alone in making such claims. He was simply the most recent in a long line of explorers who have reported similar discoveries. And unlike many before him, he came back with documentation, with coordinates, with video evidence that, while disputed, has never been definitively proven false. Hey, this is Mr. H, and if you are the kind of person who questions what we are told, who wonders what truths might be hidden just beyond the boundaries of acceptable exploration, then you are in the right place. We dive deep into the mysteries they do not want you to investigate. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this story is just beginning, and what we uncover next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the world we live on. So why would Claudio Nocelli risk everything? His reputation, his livelihood, possibly even his freedom, to sail into forbidden waters and tell a story that he knew would be ridiculed? What drives a man with 30 years of respected maritime experience to throw it all away for what mainstream science calls a delusion? The answer is simple: because he saw something real, something that exists beyond the ice walls, something that someone, or perhaps multiple someones, does not want the rest of us to know about. To understand why Claudio Nocelli's discovery is so significant, and why it has been met with such fierce resistance, we need to talk about one of the most unusual international agreements in human history, the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. On December 1st, 1959, 12 nations gathered in Washington to sign a treaty that would effectively lock down an entire continent. Today, 54 countries are signatories to this agreement. Think about that for a moment. 54 nations, many of whom cannot agree on anything, all came together to sign a treaty about Antarctica. Countries that have been enemies for centuries, nations with completely opposing political systems, rival superpowers during the Cold War, all agreed on one thing: Antarctica must be controlled. The official reasons sound noble enough. The treaty designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve, establishes freedom of scientific investigation, and bans military activity on the continent. It prohibits nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste. It sounds like environmental protection, like enlightened international cooperation for the good of science and the planet. But let us look at what the treaty actually does in practice. First, it prohibits any independent exploration of large sections of the continent without explicit governmental approval. You cannot just decide to mount an expedition to Antarctica the way you might plan a trip to climb Everest or explore the Amazon. You need permits, authorizations, and permissions from multiple international bodies. And those permissions are almost never granted to private citizens or independent researchers. Second, certain zones of Antarctica are completely off-limits, period. No explanation given. No access permitted. These are not small areas. We are talking about regions the size of entire countries that have been declared restricted zones. Why? What is in those zones that requires such absolute secrecy? Third, the treaty established an unusual system of overlapping territorial claims that are simultaneously recognized and not recognized. 7 countries claim portions of Antarctica as their sovereign territory, yet the treaty says these claims are frozen, neither accepted nor rejected. It is a legal paradox that allows these nations to maintain military-style presences in their claimed territories while officially saying they are not militarizing the continent. And here is perhaps the strangest part. The treaty can only be modified by unanimous agreement of all the consultative parties. In other words, all the major nations have to agree before anything changes. When in human history, have dozens of nations ever unanimously agreed on anything? Yet when it comes to Antarctica, they all agree that the current system must remain in place. Some researchers have pointed out that the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, just 12 years after the mysterious Operation Highjump, the largest military expedition ever sent to Antarctica. We will get deep into Operation Highjump later, but for now, just know that something happened in Antarctica in 1947 that made the world's governments decide they needed to lock down the entire continent with an international treaty. That is not speculation. That is documented historical fact. Something happened, and then they created a system to make sure nobody else could find out what it was. Now let us talk about what Claudio Nocelli actually encountered when he reached the boundaries of this protected continent: the ice walls. If you look at any official map of Antarctica, you will see a relatively circular landmass covered in ice, surrounded by ocean. The ice extends out into the water as ice shelves, and icebergs break off and float away. That is the image we have all been given. A frozen continent, gradually melting at the edges. Nothing particularly mysterious about it. But that is not what explorers actually encounter when they get there. What they find is something far more dramatic and far more difficult to explain. Massive vertical walls of ice, rising 30, 40, 50, sometimes 60 feet straight up out of the ocean. Not gentle slopes of ice, not gradually declining ice shelves, but vertical walls, in some places perfectly smooth, extending for hundreds of miles without any visible break. Captain James Cook encountered these walls in 1773 during his second voyage. Cook was perhaps the greatest navigator of his age, a man who mapped more of the Earth's surface than any explorer before him. He sailed further south than any European had ever gone, and he kept going until he could go no further. He was stopped by walls of ice. In his journals, Cook described ice formations that rose high above his ship's masts, extending in both directions beyond the horizon. He sailed along these walls for weeks, searching for any opening, any passage through. He found none. In one entry, he wrote that the ice seemed to form a barrier around whatever lay beyond, as if nature itself or something else had constructed a boundary that was not meant to be crossed. Cook circumnavigated the Antarctic region, and by his calculations, the ice walls extended for more than 60,000 miles. 60,000 miles of ice barriers, and he never found a way through to whatever lay beyond. Some people today claim that Cook never actually saw Antarctica, that he only saw ice formations in the ocean. But Cook was a professional navigator. He kept meticulous records. He understood what he was looking at. And what he was looking at was not random ice flows. It was a continuous barrier, a wall that prevented access to whatever was on the other side. 50 years after Cook, Captain James Clark Ross led another expedition to the Antarctic region in 1841. Ross commanded two ships, the Erebus and the Terror, both specially reinforced for polar exploration. He pushed further south than Cook had managed, and he too encountered the ice walls. Ross described them as resembling enormous cliffs of white marble, rising vertically from the sea. In some places, the walls were 200 feet high, towering above his ships like frozen fortresses. He wrote that the walls appeared to extend infinitely in both directions, and that the sense of scale was almost overwhelming. Some sections of the ice wall were so smooth and vertical that his crew joked, in nervous tones, that they looked almost artificially constructed. Ross mapped what is now called the Ross Ice Shelf, a massive formation that extends for hundreds of miles along the Antarctic coast. But even Ross, with his reinforced ships and experienced crew, could not penetrate beyond the outer ice barriers. He documented temperatures that plunged to lethal levels as he approached the walls, and magnetic anomalies that made navigation increasingly difficult. Then there was Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, who in 1911 became the first person to reach the South Pole. Amundsen was no stranger to extreme environments. He was tough, experienced, and skeptical of anything that could not be measured and verified. Yet even Amundsen wrote about the ice walls of Antarctica with a sense of unease. In his journals, he noted that the ice formations around Antarctica's perimeter were unlike anything he had encountered in the Arctic. They were too uniform, too continuous, too precisely formed. He wrote that while nature can certainly create impressive ice formations, the walls around Antarctica had a quality that suggested something more than random geological processes. Now, mainstream science has explanations for these ice walls. They are called ice shelves, formed when glaciers flow off the Antarctic landmass and extend out over the ocean. The leading edge of these ice shelves can indeed form vertical cliffs where chunks break off to become icebergs. This is called calving, and it is a well-documented natural process. But here is where the official explanation starts to break down. Ice shelves, by their nature, are unstable. They are constantly moving, constantly breaking apart, constantly changing. Yet the explorers who have encountered these ice walls describe them as remarkably stable and permanent. Cook found them in the 1770s, Ross found them in the 1840s, Amundsen found them in the early 1900s, and Claudio Nocelli found them in 2016. The same walls, in essentially the same locations, for over 240 years. That is not how ice shelves behave. Ice shelves are dynamic. They advance and retreat. They break apart in massive calving events. They should not maintain the same basic structure for centuries. Yet these walls apparently do. And there is another problem with the ice shelf explanation. Ice shelves have been extensively studied by modern glaciologists. We know their typical heights, their formations, their behaviors. Most ice shelf cliffs are 10 to 30 feet above water. Some can reach 50 feet in rare cases. But multiple explorers, including Nocelli, have documented ice walls reaching 60, 80, even 100 feet above the water's surface. That is far beyond what any known ice shelf produces. So what exactly did Claudio Nocelli encounter when he reached these ice walls in 2016? According to his detailed logs, he sailed along the ice barrier for 13 days, covering over 600 nautical miles. The wall was continuous, unbroken, varying in height between 30 and 70 feet above the waterline. He took measurements that suggested the ice extended at least another 100 to 200 feet below the surface. The wall was not rough and irregular like a typical ice cliff. It was smooth in most places, almost polished, as if shaped by forces beyond simple freezing and thawing. His instruments recorded strange magnetic readings as he approached the wall. His compass would spin uselessly for minutes at a time, before suddenly locking onto a direction that made no navigational sense. His GPS unit displayed coordinates that did not correspond to any known mapping system, and the temperature, which should have been brutally cold near such a massive ice formation, was actually warmer than the open ocean he had just crossed. None of this matches what we are told about Antarctic ice shelves. Nocelli documented these anomalies meticulously. He was searching for what every explorer who has ever approached these ice walls has searched for: a way through, an opening, a passage to whatever lies beyond. And after 13 days of searching, sailing east along the wall through increasingly dangerous conditions, he found one. A channel, narrow and treacherous, cutting through the ice. It was barely wide enough for his vessel. The walls on either side rose high above his mast. The passage twisted and turned, extending for what he estimated was nearly 10 miles through solid ice. At several points, he considered turning back. The channel was so narrow that if the ice shifted even slightly, his boat would be crushed. There was no guarantee the passage would lead anywhere. It could be a dead end, trapping him in a frozen maze with no way to maneuver his vessel around. But Nocelli kept going, and eventually, the channel opened up. The walls fell away, and he emerged into an ocean that was not supposed to exist. What Claudio Nocelli saw when he emerged from that ice channel defied everything he had been taught about Antarctic geography. The water temperature jumped immediately. His instruments, which had been reading between 28 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit in the outer Antarctic waters, suddenly showed readings of 45 to 50 degrees. That is a temperature increase of nearly 20 degrees in the span of less than a mile. In oceanography, such dramatic temperature changes simply do not happen unless you are crossing major ocean currents or entering completely different bodies of water. But Nocelli was not crossing a current. He was entering what appeared to be an entirely separate ocean system. The first thing that struck him was the light. Beyond the ice walls, the atmosphere had a different quality. The harsh, flat brightness of the Antarctic exterior gave way to something softer, almost hazy. There was a warmth to the light that seemed impossible at this latitude. The sky had a strange luminescence, as if the clouds themselves were generating illumination rather than just reflecting it. Nocelli checked his coordinates obsessively. According to his GPS, he was now positioned at latitude 78 degrees south, well past the Antarctic Circle, in an area that every map he had ever seen showed as solid ice. Yet here he was, sailing through open water, looking at distant shorelines that were not supposed to exist. He cut his engine and let the boat drift. For the first time in weeks, there was no sound except the gentle lapping of water against the hull. No grinding of ice, no howling polar winds. The silence was unnerving. He had spent enough time in extreme environments to know that silence often precedes danger, but nothing happened. The water remained calm. The sky remained clear. And in the distance, perhaps 20 or 30 miles away, he could see land. Not ice. Land. Dark, rocky outcrops rose from the water. There appeared to be vegetation, though at this distance he could not be certain. Through his binoculars, Nocelli observed what looked like steep cliffs dropping into the sea, with possible beaches or tidal zones at the base. The geological formations reminded him of volcanic islands he had seen in the Pacific, stark and dramatic, not the smooth ice-covered contours of Antarctica. He began taking photographs and video, documenting everything with multiple cameras to ensure he had backup evidence. He knew that what he was seeing would be disputed, attacked, dismissed. He needed proof that could withstand scrutiny. Over the next several hours, Nocelli sailed parallel to the distant coastline, trying to get close enough to see details without venturing so far that he would risk being unable to find his way back through the ice channel. The water depth readings from his sonar were equally strange. The ocean floor here was only 200 to 400 feet down, far shallower than the waters outside the ice wall, which dropped to depths of over 10,000 feet in places. This shallow ocean implied a continental shelf, which meant there was a significant landmass nearby, but according to every official map, there was no landmass here. This area was supposed to be deep ocean, covered by floating ice sheets. Yet his instruments were clearly showing shallow water, and his eyes were clearly seeing land on the horizon. As the hours passed, Nocelli noticed the wildlife. Seabirds, dozens of them, species he recognized from more temperate climates. There were birds that looked like gulls, cormorants, possibly even petrels, circling in groups above the water. These were not the penguins and squaws typical of Antarctic regions. These were birds that live in areas where there is abundant food, open water, and temperatures well above freezing. He saw something breach the surface about 100 yards from his boat. At first, he thought it was a seal, But the movement was wrong. The creature was too large, and its motion through the water too fluid. It surfaced again, closer this time, and Nocelli grabbed his camera. Through the lens, he captured what appeared to be some kind of marine mammal, possibly a whale calf or a large dolphin, but the body shape did not match any species he was familiar with. It had a sleek, dark body, with what might have been a ridge of fins along its back. It surfaced 3 times before disappearing into the depths. The temperature continued to rise. By late afternoon, his instruments were reading 54 degrees. Nocelli was standing on the deck of his boat in the supposed frozen wasteland of inner Antarctica, wearing just a sweater, completely comfortable. The air smelled different here too, less sterile. There was a mineral quality to it, almost metallic, and underneath that, something organic, like the smell of seaweed or coastal vegetation. He deployed a water sampling device and collected several bottles of seawater. Later analysis, which he had conducted at an independent laboratory, showed that the water had a lower salinity than typical Antarctic seawater and contained trace minerals consistent with geothermal activity. The water was being heated from below, warmed by volcanic or geothermal sources deep in the ocean floor. As evening approached, Nocelli faced a decision. He could attempt to reach the distant coastline, which would take several hours of sailing and would mean spending the night in these uncharted waters. Or he could turn back, return through the ice channel while he still had daylight, and preserve what evidence he had already collected. The cautious navigator in him said, "Turn back." But the explorer, the part of him that had sailed into these forbidden waters in the first place, wanted to keep going. He wanted to step foot on that land. He wanted to see what grew there, what lived there, what secrets it held. In the end, practicality won. He had come alone. If something happened to his boat, or if the weather changed, there would be no rescue. Nobody even knew he was here. Nobody would come looking. He would simply disappear, and his evidence would disappear with him. So Nocelli turned his vessel around and began the journey back toward the ice channel. But as he sailed, he kept his cameras running, documenting the coastline from every angle his position allowed. He took compass readings, GPS coordinates, sonar depth measurements, water temperature logs, everything he could think of that might corroborate his story. And then something happened that he had not anticipated. As he approached the area where he believed the ice channel entrance was located, he could not find it. The ice wall looked different. The passage he had used to enter this inner ocean had either closed or shifted, or had never been where he thought it was. For nearly an hour, Nocelli sailed along the ice wall, searching, growing increasingly anxious. His fuel was limited. His supplies were sufficient, but not infinite. And the idea of being trapped here, cut off from the world he knew, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Finally, he found an opening. Whether it was the same channel or a different one, he could not be certain. The ice walls all looked similar, but it cut through in roughly the right direction, and he had no choice but to try it. The return passage through the ice was terrifying. The channel seemed narrower than he remembered. The walls seemed to lean inward, as if the ice was slowly closing. There were sounds, deep groans and cracks that echoed through the passage, the sound of millions of tons of ice settling and shifting. Nocelli kept his engine at the lowest speed that would maintain steerage, terrified that any vibration or wake might trigger a collapse. It took 2 hours to traverse what he thought should have been a 40-minute passage, but eventually the channel widened, the walls fell away, and he emerged back into the familiar harsh cold of the outer Antarctic waters. The temperature dropped immediately. Within minutes, he went from relatively comfortable conditions to bone-numbing cold. The contrast was so stark that it felt like passing through a physical barrier, a threshold between 2 completely different worlds. Nocelli did not linger. He pointed his vessel north and began the long journey back to South America. He had his evidence. He had his coordinates. He had his samples, and his photographs, and his video. Now he needed to survive long enough to share them with the world. The return voyage took 3 weeks. During that time, Nocelli reviewed his footage obsessively, trying to find any flaw, any possible explanation that would make sense within the accepted model of Antarctic geography. He found none. What he had documented was either real, or he had experienced some kind of collective hallucination that had fooled his eyes, his instruments, and multiple cameras simultaneously. When he finally reached Ushuaia and solid ground, Nocelli spent several days simply resting and organizing his documentation. Then he began the process of trying to share his discovery with the world. He contacted scientific journals. He reached out to geographical societies. He approached documentary filmmakers and journalists. And almost universally, he was ignored or dismissed. The few who did respond told him that what he was claiming was impossible, that his evidence must be flawed, that he had clearly made some kind of navigational error. One oceanographer, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Nocelli that even if his account was accurate, it would never be officially acknowledged. The Antarctic Treaty system, the professor explained, exists for reasons that go far beyond environmental protection. There are things in Antarctica that governments have agreed should remain hidden, and anyone who claims to have found those things will be discredited, marginalized, and if necessary, silenced. Nocelli persisted. He published his findings on independent websites and alternative research forums. He gave interviews to podcasters and YouTubers willing to hear his story. He made his GPS coordinates public, challenging anyone with the means to verify his claims to do so. And that is when the trouble really started. Maritime authorities began questioning how he had obtained the permits for his journey. Tax officials suddenly took an intense interest in his financial records. His professional credentials came under scrutiny. Former colleagues distanced themselves. Job opportunities dried up. His reputation, built over 30 years of exemplary service, began to crumble. But Nocelli refused to recant, because he knew what he had seen. He knew what his instruments had recorded. He knew that beyond the ice walls of Antarctica, there is something that someone desperately does not want the rest of us to discover. And he is not the first person to reach this conclusion. In fact, his story is just one chapter in a much longer and stranger history of Antarctic exploration, a history that includes military expeditions, mysterious disappearances, and the testimony of one of the most decorated military officers in American history, a man whose discoveries in Antarctica were so shocking that they may have changed the course of the Cold War. If Claudio Nocelli's story stands alone, it is easy to dismiss as the claims of one man seeking attention, but when you place his account alongside what happened in Antarctica 70 years earlier, a pattern emerges that is far more difficult to ignore. Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd was not a fringe figure. He was not a conspiracy theorist or an attention seeker. He was one of the most celebrated explorers and military officers of the 20th century. He had flown over the North Pole in 1926, led multiple expeditions to Antarctica in the 1930s, received the Medal of Honor, and was trusted by the United States government with some of the most sensitive military operations of his era. So, when Admiral Byrd said he had discovered something extraordinary in Antarctica, people listened. And when the government immediately classified much of what he found, people started asking questions. The story begins in December of 1946, just over a year after World War II ended. The United States military launched the largest expedition to Antarctica in history. It was called Operation Highjump, though the official designation was the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program. The scale of this operation was unprecedented and remains unmatched to this day. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, 4,700 men. This was not a scientific research mission. This was a military invasion force. The fleet included an aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea, submarines, destroyers, cargo ships, tankers, and even a submarine capable of breaking through ice. The operation had a budget equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's currency. And leading this massive undertaking was Admiral Richard Byrd. The official mission statement was suitably vague. The Navy claimed they were testing equipment in cold weather conditions, establishing research bases, and training personnel for operations in Arctic environments. They said the mission would last 6 to 8 months, allowing for a full exploration of the Antarctic coastline and interior. But here is the first strange thing. Operation Highjump was terminated after just 8 weeks. The largest military expedition ever sent to Antarctica, with enough supplies and personnel for 8 months of operations, packed up and left after less than 2 months. No official explanation was ever given for the premature termination. The Navy simply stated that objectives had been met and the mission was complete. But internal documents, some of which have been declassified over the years, tell a different story. They reference equipment failures, unexpected casualties, and encounters with hostile forces. Hostile forces in Antarctica. When Admiral Byrd returned to the United States in April of 1947, he gave several interviews to the press. And what he said in those interviews is where things get really interesting. In one interview with a Chilean newspaper, Byrd stated that the United States needed to prepare defenses against enemy aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He talked about the necessity of mounting expeditions to both the Arctic and Antarctic to discover and eliminate enemy bases before they could threaten the United States. Remember, this was 1947. The war was over. Germany had been defeated. Japan had surrendered. Who was this enemy that Byrd was referring to? In another interview, Byrd made an even stranger statement. He said that Antarctica held secrets that could affect the survival of humanity, that beyond the South Pole there existed an area he called the Land of Eternal Mystery, and that he had seen things there that would be hard for anyone to believe. Then Byrd was debriefed by military intelligence, and he stopped talking publicly about Operation Highjump. For the next several years, he maintained silence about what he had actually encountered in Antarctica. But he kept a personal diary, and entries from that diary, whether authentic or fabricated, has been debated for decades, describe experiences that read like science fiction. According to the controversial diary entries dated February 19th, 1947, Byrd was flying over the polar plateau when his instruments began malfunctioning. The magnetic compass spun wildly. The temperature gauges showed impossible readings. And then, according to the entries, he saw something that should not exist. Green vegetation, mountains without snow, what he described as a lush valley in the middle of the frozen wasteland. The diary describes Byrd ordering his aircraft to descend for a closer look. As they approached, they allegedly encountered aircraft of a type they had never seen before, disc-shaped craft that flew alongside Byrd's plane with impossible maneuverability. The diary claims these craft somehow took control of his plane and guided it to land in this hidden valley. What followed reads like an encounter with an advanced civilization. Byrd described being greeted by tall, fair-haired people who spoke perfect English and told him they were concerned about humanity's use of atomic weapons. They said that their civilization had been observing the surface world for centuries and that they had decided it was time to make contact with certain representatives of the surface governments. They asked Byrd to carry a message back to his superiors, warning that humanity was on a dangerous path and needed to change course. Now, before we go further, we need to address the elephant in the room. This diary has never been conclusively verified as authentic. Many researchers believe it is a fabrication, created years after Byrd's death in 1957, to support certain theories about inner Earth civilizations. The writing style does not perfectly match Byrd's verified journals, and the narrative hits too many familiar notes from science fiction of that era. But here is what we know for certain. Admiral Byrd did lead Operation Highjump. The mission was massive and was cut short without adequate explanation. Byrd did give interviews where he made cryptic references to discoveries in Antarctica. He was debriefed and essentially silenced about the mission, and something happened down there that made the United States government, along with multiple other nations, decide that Antarctica needed to be locked down under international treaty just 12 years later. There are declassified documents from Operation Highjump that raise more questions than they answer. Mission reports that mention significant casualties but give no details about how those casualties occurred. References to equipment losses that are not explained. And perhaps most intriguing, reports of aerial reconnaissance that discovered ice-free areas with visible land, features that did not appear on any existing maps. One declassified report describes an ice-free zone covering approximately 40,000 square miles in the interior of Antarctica, with visible mountain ranges and what appeared to be vegetation. The area was marked for further investigation, but there is no public record of any follow-up expeditions to that specific location. Other documents reference caves large enough to fly aircraft into, geothermal vents creating warm zones in the middle of the ice, and magnetic anomalies so severe that they made navigation nearly impossible in certain areas. All of this is documented in official Navy records, not conspiracy websites. After Operation Highjump, the United States sent another major expedition to Antarctica in 1955. This one was called Operation Deep Freeze, and again, Admiral Byrd was involved, though in a more limited capacity due to his age. Operation Deep Freeze established permanent research stations and continued the work that Highjump had begun, and once again, much of what was discovered remains classified to this day. Byrd himself returned to Antarctica multiple times in the early 1950s. In his final expedition in 1956, just a year before his death, he allegedly flew over the South Pole and into the interior regions one more time. When he returned, he gave one final interview where he reiterated that Antarctica held the key to unlocking mysteries about humanity's past and possibly our future. He died the following year, in 1957, at the age of 68. The official cause of death was heart disease, though some researchers have noted the convenient timing of his death coming just as he seemed prepared to speak more openly about his Antarctic discoveries. So what connects Admiral Byrd's experiences in 1947 to Claudio Nocelli's discoveries in 2016? On the surface, they seem like completely different stories. Byrd was flying over the interior of Antarctica, while Nocelli sailed along the coast. Byrd was leading a military operation with thousands of men, while Nocelli was alone in a small yacht. Byrd encountered alleged advanced civilizations, while Nocelli found empty oceans and uninhabited shores. But look closer at the details, and the connections become apparent. Both men reported finding areas of Antarctica that were warmer than they should be. Both encountered magnetic anomalies that disrupted their navigation equipment. Both discovered land masses or open water in regions that official maps show as solid ice. And both were essentially silenced after sharing their findings. Byrd, through military classification and early death. Nocelli through professional destruction and public ridicule. There is another connection that runs even deeper. The coordinates that Nocelli recorded for the ice channel he passed through, when plotted on a map, fall within the same general region that Operation Highjump reports identified as containing ice-free zones and unexplained geographical features. The area lies roughly between 75 and 80 degrees south latitude, in a sector that remains heavily restricted and barely explored even today. Is it possible that Nocelli sailed into the same hidden region that Byrd flew over 70 years earlier? Is there an actual warm zone beyond Antarctica's ice walls? A place where the ocean remains open and land masses exist that have been deliberately kept off official maps? The more you dig into Operation Highjump, the more questions arise. Why did the most powerful military in the world send nearly 5,000 men to Antarctica immediately after World War II? What were they really looking for? What did they find that was significant enough to warrant the creation of an international treaty locking down an entire continent? And why, in the decades since, has exploration of Antarctica remained so tightly controlled and restricted? Admiral Byrd took many of those answers to his grave, but his actions speak louder than his words. A decorated military officer, a rational and respected explorer, returned from Antarctica convinced that he had encountered something extraordinary, something important enough that he spent the last decade of his life trying to return there, trying to investigate further, and trying, in his limited way, to tell the world that Antarctica holds secrets we are not being told about. And he was not alone in that conviction, because Operation Highjump was not the only military expedition to Antarctica in the years following World War II. Other nations sent their own missions, and some of those missions have stories that are, if anything, even stranger than what happened to Admiral Byrd. The United States was not the first nation to take a peculiar interest in Antarctica during the World War II era. In fact, one of the most controversial and least discussed chapters in Antarctic exploration began several years before Operation Highjump, and it involved the Third Reich. Between 1938 and 1939, Nazi Germany launched an expedition to Antarctica that remains shrouded in secrecy and speculation. It was called the German Antarctic Expedition, officially led by Captain Alfred Richter, and its stated purpose was to establish a German territorial claim in the region and to scout locations for a potential whaling station. But the scale and nature of this expedition suggests motivations that went far beyond whaling. The Germans outfitted a ship called the Schwabenland with some of the most advanced equipment available at the time. They brought aircraft specifically modified for polar exploration, cameras for aerial reconnaissance, and scientific instruments whose purposes were never fully disclosed. The expedition spent several months in Antarctica, during which German aircraft flew dozens of missions over a vast area of the continent, dropping thousands of metal markers emblazoned with swastikas to claim the territory for the Reich. They called the region Neuschwabenland, or New Swabia. It covered an area of approximately 230,000 square miles, roughly the size of France. And according to the expedition reports that have been made public, the Germans were particularly interested in a specific area of ice-free mountain ranges they discovered during their flights. Now here is where documented history ends and speculation begins. But the speculation is based on enough fragmentary evidence that it cannot be completely dismissed. Throughout the war years, there were persistent reports of unusual submarine activity in the South Atlantic and near Antarctic waters. German U-boats were known to have operated in those regions, and several U-boats that left European ports in the final days of the war were never accounted for. They did not surrender, they were not sunk in combat, and their crews never returned home. They simply vanished. After the war ended, there were reports, never officially confirmed, that some of these submarines had been tasked with transporting cargo and personnel to secret installations. The most persistent rumor involved a base that supposedly existed in the New Swabia region, referred to in whispered conversations as Base 211. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the German U-boat fleet and later became the head of the German Navy, made several statements during the war that have fueled these theories. In 1943, he reportedly said that the German submarine fleet had built an invulnerable fortress for the Führer in another part of the world. When asked to elaborate, he remained silent. After the war, during his interrogation, he was questioned about secret bases in Antarctica, but provided no clear answers. The evidence for an actual Nazi base in Antarctica is circumstantial at best. There are no photographs, no captured documents explicitly describing such a facility, no physical remains that have been found and verified. But there are enough strange pieces to the puzzle that serious researchers continue to investigate the possibility. In 1945, just months after the war ended, the Argentine Navy reported encountering a damaged German submarine off the coast of Argentina. The U-boat surrendered, and its crew was taken into custody. During interrogation, the submarine's captain made cryptic references to having transported important cargo to a location far to the south. He would not elaborate, even under intense questioning. Another U-boat, the U-530, surrendered in Argentina in July of 1945, more than 2 months after Germany's official surrender. The submarine was carrying a crew but no torpedoes, and very little fuel. Where had it been for those 2 months? What had it been doing? The captain refused to answer, and the Argentine authorities eventually stopped asking. Then there are the testimonies, unverified but numerous, from sailors and officers who claim to have knowledge of Antarctic operations. One former U-boat crewman, interviewed in the 1970s, stated that he had been part of a mission to transport scientific equipment and personnel to Antarctica in 1944. He described navigating through ice channels similar to what Claudio Nocelli would report 70 years later, arriving at an ice-free harbour and unloading cargo at a facility carved into the rock beneath the ice. Was he telling the truth? Was he embellishing? Was he simply repeating stories he had heard? There is no way to verify his account, but he is one of several individuals who came forward with similar stories over the decades. And while each individual account can be questioned, the pattern itself is harder to dismiss. This brings us back to Operation Highjump. Some researchers have theorized that the real purpose of that massive military expedition was not scientific research or cold weather training. It was a search and destroy mission targeting German holdouts who had established a presence in Antarctica. This theory would explain several otherwise puzzling aspects of the operation. It would explain why such a large military force was necessary. It would explain the combat-ready nature of the task force, including aircraft carriers and armed destroyers. It would explain the reports of casualties and the premature termination of the mission. And it would explain why so much of Operation Highjump remains classified more than 75 years after it occurred. If American forces did encounter resistance in Antarctica, whether from German holdouts or from something else entirely, it would be one of the most closely guarded military secrets of the 20th century. Admitting that enemy forces had established a base in Antarctica and had successfully repelled a United States military operation would have been a propaganda disaster, especially in the early days of the Cold War, when American military supremacy was a crucial element of national security strategy. But the Nazi connection is only one thread in a much larger tapestry of Antarctic mysteries. Because Germany was not the only nation showing unusual interest in the frozen continent during the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union conducted multiple expeditions to Antarctica during the 1950s and 60s, and very little information about these expeditions was ever made public. Soviet research stations were established in some of the most remote and inhospitable regions of the continent, locations that made no sense from a purely scientific standpoint. Why place a research station in an area that is almost impossible to supply and offers no particular research advantages unless there is something specific in that location you want to study? One Soviet expedition in 1964 reportedly discovered a series of underground caverns warmed by geothermal heat. The caverns allegedly extended for miles beneath the ice, creating a hidden network of tunnels and chambers where the temperature remained above freezing year-round. The discovery was documented in internal reports but never published in scientific journals. Later expeditions were sent to the same area, but their findings remain classified by the Russian government to this day. British explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, who led multiple Antarctic expeditions in the early 1900s, wrote in his private journals about strange sightings and unexplained phenomena. In one entry from 1915, he described hearing sounds from beneath the ice, low-frequency rumbles that his men initially thought were earthquakes, but which occurred with such regularity that they seemed almost rhythmic, almost purposeful. Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who reached the South Pole in 1911, also documented unusual observations. In his journals, he noted areas where his magnetic compass became completely unreliable, spinning without settling on any direction. He described zones where the temperature would rise unexpectedly, creating patches of exposed rock in the middle of otherwise unbroken ice fields. And he mentioned, though only briefly, the sense his men had of being watched when they ventured into certain unexplored valleys. These accounts from multiple explorers, across multiple decades, from multiple nations, all describe similar phenomena: magnetic anomalies, unexpected warm zones, ice-free areas that should not exist, strange sounds and sensations. Are all of these men simply mistaken? Are they all fabricating stories? Or were they all encountering the same underlying reality, a reality that for various reasons has been kept from public knowledge? Captain Robert Falcon Scott, the British explorer who died during his return from the South Pole in 1912, left journals that include several cryptic passages. In one, he wrote about the feeling that Antarctica was hiding something, that beneath the ice there were secrets that nature or perhaps something else did not want revealed. Scott was a rational man, not given to flights of fancy, yet even he seemed to sense that there was more to Antarctica than met the eye. What ties all these accounts together, from Nazi expeditions to Admiral Byrd to Claudio Nocelli, is a consistent pattern. Explorers go to Antarctica expecting one thing and encountering something else. They find warmth where there should be cold. They find open water where there should be ice. They find land where maps show none. Their instruments malfunction in specific locations, and when they return and try to report what they found, they are either silenced or ignored. The Nazi Antarctic mystery may never be fully solved. Too much time has passed. Too many witnesses are dead. Too many documents have been destroyed or remain locked in classified archives. But the questions remain. What were the Germans really doing in New Swabia? Did they establish a base? If so, what happened to it? And is it possible that what they discovered in Antarctica was significant enough to warrant a massive American military response in Operation Highjump? We may never have definitive answers, but the pattern of secrecy, the consistency of explorer testimonies, and the extreme measures taken to control access to Antarctica all point to one conclusion. There is something in Antarctica that powerful interests do not want the general public to discover, something that has been known about, at least in certain circles, for nearly a century. Something that connects Nazi expeditions, American military operations, and modern-day navigators like Claudio Nocelli, who dare to venture beyond the boundaries they have established. The modern mysteries of Antarctica become even more perplexing when you realize that this supposedly undiscovered continent appears on maps that predate its official discovery by centuries. Maps that show details no explorer of that era could possibly have known. Maps that suggest someone, at some point in history, had knowledge of Antarctica that has since been lost or deliberately hidden. The most famous of these impossible maps is the Piri Reis map of 1513. Piri Reis was an Ottoman admiral and cartographer who created a world map that has baffled historians and geographers since its rediscovery in 1929. The map was found in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, drawn on gazelle skin, and what it shows should not be possible. The southern portion of the Piri Reis map depicts the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy. But here is the problem. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. And even more impossible, the Piri Reis map shows the coastline of Antarctica as it would appear without ice. Think about what that means. The map shows mountains, rivers, and coastal details of Antarctica that are currently buried under miles of ice. Details that modern humans only discovered using ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys in the 1950s and 60s. Details that should have been hidden for millions of years. When the map was first analyzed by modern cartographers, many assumed it was simply inaccurate, that the southern landmass depicted was actually South America distorted by the limitations of 16th century mapmaking. But in 1960, a professor of the history of science at Georgetown University named Charles Hapgood decided to investigate more thoroughly. Hapgood had the map analyzed by the United States Air Force Cartographic Division. He wanted to know if there was any way the southern landmass could be something other than Antarctica. The Air Force cartographers studied the map for months, comparing it to modern geographical data. Their conclusion, delivered in a formal letter, was stunning. The features shown on the lower part of the Piri Reis map agree remarkably with the results of seismic profiles made across the top of the ice cap by Swedish and British expeditions. This suggests that the coastline was mapped before it was covered by ice. The ice cap in this region is now about 1 mile thick. Read that again. The United States Air Force officially concluded that the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica as it existed before the ice cap formed. We are not talking about a few hundred years. We are talking about a map that depicts geographical features from at least 6,000 years ago, possibly much longer. So how did Piri Reis create this map? He left notes on the map itself explaining his sources. He wrote that he compiled his map from approximately 20 older maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before the Common Era, and others even older than that. He claimed these ancient source maps had been preserved in the Library of Constantinople. This means that someone, thousands of years before the modern age of exploration, had mapped Antarctica in extensive detail. Someone had sailed to Antarctica, explored its coastline, and charted its features during a time when that coastline was not covered by ice. And that knowledge had been preserved, copied, and passed down through various civilizations until it reached Piri Reis in the early 1500s. But the Piri Reis map is not the only example of this lost cartographic knowledge. In 1531, a French mathematician and cartographer named Orontius Phineas created another world map that shows Antarctica. Unlike the Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineas map depicts the continent with details that should have been unknown at the time. The Orontius Phineas map shows Antarctica as a distinct continent, roughly the correct size and shape, positioned at the South Pole. It shows mountain ranges in the interior of the continent. It shows rivers flowing from those mountains to the coast. All of this corresponds with what we now know lies beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, information we only obtained in the 20th century using modern technology. The map even shows Antarctica as two separate land masses divided by a waterway, which matches the reality that East Antarctica and West Antarctica are actually separate landmasses connected by an ice bridge. How could Orontius Phineas have known this in 1531? Then there is the Philippe Boissche map of 1748. Boissche was the royal geographer of France, a serious academic, not someone prone to wild speculation. His map of Antarctica shows the continent divided into two main islands by a channel of water. Modern surveys have confirmed that if you removed all the ice from Antarctica, you would indeed find a channel of water separating East and West Antarctica, exactly as Boische's map shows. Boissche included notes on his map stating that he based his depiction of Antarctica on much older maps that were no longer extant. He believed these older maps dated back to ancient times and represented genuine geographical knowledge that had somehow been preserved. So we have multiple maps, created by different cartographers in different countries across several centuries, all showing Antarctica with details that should have been impossible to know, all of them referencing even older source maps that have since been lost. This is not a coincidence. This is evidence of a body of ancient geographical knowledge that was far more advanced than mainstream history acknowledges. The implications are staggering. If Antarctica was mapped before it was covered by ice, that means there was a civilization capable of ocean navigation, cartography, and exploration at least 6,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. A civilization that had the technology and organization to mount expeditions to the most remote parts of the Earth. A civilization whose existence has been almost entirely erased from the historical record. This brings us to the work of researchers like Graham Hancock, who has spent decades investigating evidence of advanced prehistoric civilizations. Hancock argues that before the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, there existed a sophisticated global civilization that was largely destroyed by catastrophic climate change and rising sea levels. According to this theory, the survivors of this civilization scattered to various parts of the world, bringing their knowledge with them. They became the mysterious teachers and culture bringers mentioned in the myths of almost every ancient civilization, the Viracocha of South American legend, the Thoth of Egyptian mythology, the Oannas of Mesopotamian tradition, all of them described as bearded strangers arriving from across the sea, bringing knowledge of agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and mathematics. Could some of these survivors have come from Antarctica? Could Antarctica have been home to a thriving civilization during a warmer period before the ice cap formed? The geological evidence suggests that Antarctica was not always frozen. Core samples taken from the Antarctic ice sheet show layers of sediment that could only have been deposited when the land was ice-free and had rivers, lakes, and vegetation. Mainstream geology tells us this ice-free period ended millions of years ago, long before humans existed. But what if that timeline is wrong? What if Antarctica remained partially ice-free, much more recently than we have been told? What if the maps are not showing us Antarctica from millions of years ago, but from 12,000 years ago, or even 6,000 years ago? There is a theory, controversial but supported by some geological evidence, called Earth crust displacement. The theory suggests that the outer crust of the Earth can shift rapidly over the mantle beneath it, causing entire continents to move to different latitudes in a relatively short period of time. If such a displacement occurred, Antarctica could have been located in a more temperate zone in the relatively recent past, allowing for human habitation and exploration. This would explain the maps. It would explain why ancient civilizations seem to have had knowledge of Antarctica, and it would explain why that knowledge was gradually lost as the continent shifted to its current polar position and became covered in ice. The ancient maps of Antarctica are not just cartographic curiosities. They are evidence that challenges our entire understanding of human history. They suggest that the story we have been told about the development of civilization, the idea that humans went from primitive hunter-gatherers to advanced societies in a neat linear progression over the last 5,000 years, is incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. There was knowledge in the ancient world that we have lost. Knowledge of geography, navigation, and possibly much more. Knowledge that suggests our ancestors were more advanced, more widely traveled, and more globally connected than mainstream archaeology admits. And if ancient civilizations knew about Antarctica, If they mapped it and possibly even lived there, then what else did they know? What other secrets have been lost or hidden? And is it possible that some of that ancient knowledge still exists, preserved in places like Antarctica, where the ice has kept it hidden for thousands of years? When Claudio Nocelli sailed beyond the ice walls and found land that was not supposed to exist, when Admiral Byrd flew over ice-free zones that official maps do not show, were they rediscovering something that was known to the ancients? Were they stumbling upon the remnants of a lost world that has been deliberately kept secret, or has simply been forgotten by the passage of time? The ancient maps tell us that Antarctica holds secrets that go back thousands of years. The modern explorers tell us that those secrets are still there, still hidden, still protected by walls of ice and international treaties. And somewhere in that frozen wilderness, the truth about our past and possibly our future lies waiting to be discovered. We have covered a lot of ground so far, from modern navigators breaking through ice walls to ancient maps that should not exist. But before we go deeper into what might be hidden beneath the Antarctic ice, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. Are you in North America, Europe, Asia, Australia? And more importantly, do you think those ancient maps represent real lost knowledge? Or is there another explanation? The community we are building here is filled with people who question the official narratives, so let your voice be heard. What do you believe is really going on in Antarctica? The discovery of ancient maps showing ice-free Antarctica raises an uncomfortable question. If the continent was once habitable, if civilizations once thrived there, where did they go when the ice came? Did they simply perish? Their cities and cultures buried forever under miles of frozen water? Or is it possible that some of them survived by going underground? The idea of vast underground spaces beneath the Antarctic ice is not science fiction. It is established scientific fact. In 1996, Russian scientists drilling at their Vostok research station in East Antarctica made an extraordinary discovery. More than 2 miles beneath the surface ice, they detected a massive body of liquid water. Lake Vostok, as it came to be known, is one of the largest lakes on Earth, covering an area of approximately 5,400 square miles. That makes it roughly the size of Lake Ontario. But Lake Vostok is not on the surface. It exists in complete darkness, sealed beneath 2.5 miles of ice, cut off from the atmosphere and from sunlight for potentially millions of years. The lake is kept liquid by geothermal heat rising from the Earth's core and by the immense pressure of the ice above it. When scientists analyzed ice samples from just above the lake, they found something unexpected: microbial life. Bacteria that had adapted to survive in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. This discovery fundamentally changed our understanding of where life can exist. If life can thrive in the darkness beneath Antarctic ice, then life could potentially exist in similarly extreme environments on other worlds, beneath the ice caps of Jupiter's moon Europa or Saturn's moon Enceladus. But here is what makes Lake Vostok truly intriguing. The Russians stopped drilling just before they reached the lake itself. Officially, they stopped because of environmental concerns, not wanting to contaminate this pristine ecosystem with drilling fluids and surface bacteria. That explanation makes sense. But some researchers have noted that the Russian drilling program had been pushing forward aggressively for years, and the sudden halt came shortly after they reportedly detected unusual magnetic readings emanating from the lake area. Since the initial drilling stopped, access to Lake Vostok has been heavily restricted. A handful of subsequent expeditions have been conducted, but the findings have not been made fully public. We know that samples were taken. We know that some form of life was found, but the details remain classified by the Russian government. Lake Vostok is not unique. Scientists have now identified over 400 subglacial lakes beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Some are small, just a few miles across. Others are enormous. These lakes are connected by rivers that flow beneath the ice, creating a hidden hydrological system that covers much of the continent. And where there is liquid water and geothermal heat, there is the potential for life. Not just bacterial life, but potentially more complex ecosystems. Some biologists have theorized that these subglacial lakes could harbor species that have been isolated from the surface world for millions of years, evolving in complete darkness into forms we cannot yet imagine. But the existence of subglacial lakes raises another possibility, one that connects back to the accounts of explorers like Admiral Byrd and Claudio Nocelli. If there are vast spaces of liquid water beneath the ice, could there also be air-filled caverns and tunnels? Could there be entire underground environments, warmed by volcanic activity, where the temperature remains above freezing year-round? The geology of Antarctica makes this not only possible but likely. Antarctica sits on top of one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth. There are numerous volcanoes scattered across the continent, some of them active. Mount Erebus, located on Ross Island, is one of the most active volcanoes in the world, with a permanent lava lake at its summit. Beneath the ice, there are many more volcanic features that we can only detect through seismic surveys. Volcanic activity produces heat. That heat melts ice from below, creating cavities and tunnels. Over time, these spaces can grow, fed by continued volcanic activity and geothermal vents. In some areas of Antarctica, scientists have detected caverns large enough to fit entire cathedrals, spaces where the ice has melted away entirely, leaving behind air-filled voids. In 2017, researchers mapping the area around Mount Erebus discovered a network of caves carved into the ice by volcanic steam. The temperature inside these caves can reach 60 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to support plant life, and they found it. Mosses and algae growing in the twilight zone near the cave entrances, and evidence suggesting that more complex plant life might exist deeper inside where the warmth is greater. If such ecosystems can exist in caves we know about, what might exist in the much larger cavern systems that we suspect are there but have not yet fully explored? And more provocatively, could such underground spaces be large enough and stable enough to support human habitation? This brings us back to Admiral Byrd's controversial diary entries describing a vast underground world beneath the polar ice. While the diary's authenticity remains disputed, the concept it describes, an inhabited realm beneath Antarctica, is not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. The Hollow Earth theory has existed in various forms for centuries. Early versions suggested that the entire planet was hollow, with openings at the poles leading to an interior world. Modern geology has thoroughly disproven that idea. We know the Earth has a solid inner core, a molten outer core, a mantle, and a crust. The planet is not hollow, but that does not mean there are not substantial hollow spaces within the crust itself. Cave systems exist on every continent. Some of them are enormous. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky has over 400 miles of surveyed passages. Krubera Cave in Georgia descends more than 7,000 feet below the surface. If such massive cave systems can exist in temperate regions, what might exist in Antarctica, where volcanic activity and geothermal heat have been working for millions of years to melt the ice from below? Some researchers have suggested that if an advanced civilization existed in Antarctica before the ice came, they might have survived by retreating underground. They would have had strong motivation. The surface was becoming uninhabitable, but beneath the ice, warmed by geothermal heat, life could continue. Over generations, this underground population could have developed technologies and societies entirely separate from those on the surface world. Is there any evidence for such a civilization? Not direct evidence, no, but there are anomalies that are difficult to explain. Satellite thermal imaging has detected areas of Antarctica where the surface temperature is significantly higher than surrounding regions, suggesting substantial heat sources beneath the ice. Some of these hotspots can be explained by known volcanic activity. Others cannot. They appear in regions where there are no detected volcanoes, no obvious geological features that would generate such heat. There are also reports from research station personnel, most of them unofficial and unverified, of strange sounds detected beneath the ice. Low-frequency pulses, rhythmic patterns that do not match any known geological process. These sounds have been recorded at multiple locations and at multiple times, but they are rarely discussed in official scientific literature. Then there are the biological anomalies that Claudio Nocelli reported during his voyage beyond the ice walls. Birds and marine life that should not exist in Antarctic waters. Species adapted to temperate climates, appearing in an environment that should be far too cold for them. In recent years, scientists have documented similar anomalies, populations of fish in Antarctic waters that contain antifreeze proteins, allowing them to survive in sub-zero temperatures. Seal species that dive to extraordinary depths, far beyond where they should be able to find food, raising questions about what they might be feeding on in the deep underwater caverns. Even plant species, mosses and lichens, that appear to be growing in areas where there should be no sunlight and no liquid water. One particularly strange discovery occurred in 2013, when researchers studying ocean currents near Antarctica detected unusual chemical signatures in the water. The chemicals were organic compounds, complex molecules that are typically associated with biological activity, but they were appearing in concentrations and combinations that did not match any known Antarctic organism. When the research team tried to trace the source of these compounds, they found that they were emerging from beneath the ice sheet, flowing out through underwater channels connected to the subglacial lake system. The team published a preliminary paper suggesting that there might be a much more diverse ecosystem beneath the Antarctic ice than anyone had previously suspected. That paper was followed by a second paper 6 months later that largely walked back the conclusions of the first, stating that the chemical signatures could be explained by known geological processes and did not necessarily indicate complex biological activity. Several members of the original research team distanced themselves from the second paper, and one researcher, speaking anonymously, suggested that pressure had been applied to downplay the findings. Whether that account is accurate or not, it fits a pattern we have seen throughout this investigation. Unusual discoveries in Antarctica are consistently downplayed, explained away, or classified. Information is controlled, access is restricted, and researchers who make claims that challenge the accepted narrative find themselves marginalized. So what is really beneath the Antarctic ice? Vast subglacial lakes teeming with undiscovered life forms, volcanic cavern systems large enough to support complex ecosystems, the remnants of ancient civilizations that retreated underground when the ice came, or something else entirely, something we have not yet imagined. We know for certain that there is far more beneath the Antarctic ice than just frozen water and rock. We know that life exists there, that liquid water exists there, that warmth exists there. What we do not know is the full extent of what is hidden, and whether anyone, human or otherwise, might be living in those hidden spaces right now. If Antarctica is just a frozen wasteland with nothing to hide, then why is information about it so heavily controlled? Why are satellite images of certain areas deliberately obscured? And why do researchers who make controversial discoveries consistently face professional consequences? Let us start with what you can see right now from your own computer. Open Google Earth. Zoom in on Antarctica. You will notice something immediately strange. While most of the planet is mapped in high resolution, with details clear enough to see individual cars and buildings, large portions of Antarctica are blurred, pixelated, or simply blank. The official explanation is that these areas lack high-resolution satellite coverage because there is nothing of interest there and the cost of detailed imaging is not justified. But that explanation falls apart when you examine which areas are obscured. Some of the most heavily censored regions on Google Earth correspond exactly to locations where researchers have reported anomalies, warm zones, detected by thermal imaging, magnetic anomalies that disrupt navigation equipment, areas that Operation Highjump identified as containing unusual geographical features. These are not random blank spots. They are deliberate redactions. In 2006, a retired Navy flight engineer named Brian came forward with a disturbing account. He had worked on transport missions to Antarctica in the late 1990s, flying scientists and supplies to various research stations. During one mission, his aircraft was diverted from its planned route to avoid what air traffic control described as restricted airspace. Brian asked the pilot about the restriction. The pilot, whom he had known for years, told him to look out the window. Brian saw what appeared to be a massive opening in the ice, a hole large enough that his aircraft could have flown into it. The edges looked smooth, almost machined. As they banked away, he saw structures near the opening, clearly artificial, not natural ice formations. When they landed, Brian was told by a superior officer that he had not seen what he thought he saw, that it was an optical illusion caused by unusual ice formations and shadows. He was instructed not to discuss the flight with anyone. When he persisted in asking questions, he was removed from Antarctic flight duty and reassigned to domestic operations. His security clearance was downgraded. His career effectively stalled. Brian kept silent for nearly a decade, but eventually decided to share his story with researchers investigating Antarctic mysteries. He provided documentation of his flight records and the names of other crew members who were on that flight. Attempts to contact those crew members have been unsuccessful. Most have refused to comment, and one responded only to say that he had signed non-disclosure agreements that prevented him from discussing anything related to his Antarctic service. Stories like Brian's are not isolated incidents. There is a pattern of individuals being silenced, intimidated, or professionally destroyed when they attempt to share information about Antarctica that contradicts the official narrative. In 2001, a geologist working at an American research station in Antarctica reported finding evidence of recent construction activity in an area that was supposed to be pristine and untouched. He documented metal fragments, concrete-like materials, and what appeared to be the remnants of electrical cables buried in ice layers that he estimated were only 50 to 100 years old. He sent his findings to his university and to several geological journals. Within weeks, he was informed that his contract with the Antarctic Research Program would not be renewed. His samples were confiscated for further analysis and never returned. His data was classified as preliminary and potentially erroneous. When he tried to publish his findings independently, he was threatened with legal action for violating the terms of his research agreement. The geologist, who has requested anonymity, eventually abandoned his Antarctic research entirely and now works in a completely different field. He has stated that the experience taught him that some questions are not meant to be asked, and that certain discoveries, if they contradict established narratives, will be suppressed regardless of scientific merit. This pattern extends beyond individual researchers. Entire research programs have been shut down when they ventured into controversial territory. In the early 2000s, a multinational team was conducting a comprehensive survey of Antarctica's subglacial lake systems using advanced ground-penetrating radar. The project was well-funded, scientifically ambitious, and had the backing of multiple governments. Then, in 2004, the project was abruptly terminated. The official reason given was budget constraints and a reallocation of resources to other priorities. But members of the research team have a different story. They claim that the project was shut down immediately after the team detected unusual structural formations beneath the ice in the vicinity of Lake Vostok. The formations did not match any known geological features. They appeared regular, geometric, possibly artificial. When the team requested authorization to investigate further, they were denied. When they persisted, funding was cut. The data they had collected was classified, and team members were required to sign agreements preventing them from discussing their findings publicly. One team member, a Swedish physicist, violated that agreement in 2012 by publishing an article in an alternative science journal describing what they had found. He presented evidence of radar returns, suggesting man-made structures at a depth of approximately 2 miles beneath the ice. He called for a renewed investigation with better equipment and full transparency. The response was swift. His academic credentials were questioned. His methodology was attacked by mainstream scientists who had not reviewed his data. His funding for unrelated research projects was mysteriously withdrawn. Within a year, he had lost his position at his university and had effectively been blacklisted from the international scientific community. Now let us turn to the satellite evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Modern satellite technology is incredibly advanced. We have satellites that can read license plates from orbit. We have imaging systems that can detect underground structures, map ocean floors, and identify heat signatures from individual buildings. We have near-complete coverage of the entire Earth's surface, updated regularly with high-resolution imagery, except for Antarctica. Multiple satellite imaging systems, including those operated by commercial companies like Google and government agencies like NASA, show consistent gaps and quality degradation when it comes to certain Antarctic regions. Some of these gaps can be explained by the challenges of polar orbit photography and the extreme weather conditions that can interfere with imaging. But not all of them. In 2015, a group of independent researchers analyzed the available satellite imagery of Antarctica and identified patterns in what was obscured and what was not. They found that areas showing thermal anomalies, locations mentioned in declassified military documents, and regions corresponding to reported explorer discoveries were significantly more likely to have poor image quality or to be completely censored. The researchers published their findings online, presenting side-by-side comparisons of Antarctic imagery with imagery of similarly remote locations in the Arctic, Siberia, and the Himalayas. The difference was stark. While those other regions had detailed high-resolution coverage, large swaths of Antarctica remained mysteriously obscured. Within days of publishing their analysis, the website hosting the research was taken offline. The researchers received cease and desist letters citing copyright violations for their use of satellite imagery. When they attempted to republish on other platforms, those platforms were threatened with legal action. The research still exists in fragments across various internet archives, but it has been effectively scrubbed from mainstream access. Then there are the magnetic anomalies, detectable even through satellite magnetometry. Antarctica has some of the strangest magnetic readings on Earth. Compasses malfunction, GPS systems provide incorrect coordinates, aircraft instruments go haywire in specific locations. Mainstream science attributes these anomalies to the proximity of the South Magnetic Pole and to unusual concentrations of magnetic minerals in the Antarctic crust. But that explanation does not account for the specificity of these anomalies. They do not occur uniformly across Antarctica. They cluster in particular areas, some of them quite small, where the magnetic interference is so severe that navigation becomes nearly impossible. Claudio Nocelli experienced these anomalies firsthand. His compass spun uselessly. His GPS displayed coordinates that placed him in the middle of solid ice, according to every map, yet he was clearly sailing through open water. These were not equipment malfunctions. Multiple backup systems all showed the same impossible readings. Other explorers have reported identical experiences. Areas where every navigation instrument fails simultaneously. Zones where radio communications are disrupted by interference that has no identifiable source. Locations where the magnetic field is so distorted that it seems almost deliberately engineered to prevent precise positioning. What could cause such specific and powerful magnetic anomalies? Natural geological features can certainly create magnetic interference, but typically not with the precision and consistency reported in Antarctica. Some researchers have suggested that large metallic structures buried beneath the ice could generate such fields. Others have proposed that whatever volcanic or geothermal activity is warming the subglacial lakes might also be creating electromagnetic phenomena. And then there are the incidents that are almost never discussed publicly, the disappearances. Over the past 70 years, numerous researchers, explorers, and military personnel have vanished in Antarctica under circumstances that were never adequately explained. Some disappearances can be attributed to the harsh environment. People get caught in storms, fall into crevasses, suffer equipment failures. Antarctica is one of the most dangerous places on Earth, and casualties are expected, but some cases do not fit that pattern. In 1965, a team of 3 American scientists conducting magnetic field surveys disappeared without a trace. Their camp was found intact, their equipment undisturbed, their provisions untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of an accident, no bodies ever recovered. The official report concluded that they must have wandered away from camp and perished in the cold. But their colleagues found that explanation implausible. These were experienced researchers who understood Antarctic safety protocols. In 1984, a Soviet researcher disappeared from Vostok Station. Security footage showed him leaving the main building and walking toward a restricted area of the facility. He never returned. Search teams found his tracks leading to the edge of a recently drilled bore hole, but there was no evidence he had fallen in. The tracks simply stopped. More recently, in 2016, the same year Claudio Nocelli made his voyage, an Australian researcher went missing during a routine supply mission to a remote field camp. His snowmobile was found abandoned near an area marked on internal maps as a magnetic anomaly zone. Despite extensive searching, no trace of the researcher was ever found. Are these just tragic accidents in a hostile environment? Or is there something in Antarctica that poses a threat to those who venture into the wrong areas, who ask the wrong questions, who discover things they were not meant to discover? The evidence of government suppression is undeniable. Information is controlled. Researchers are silenced. Satellite imagery is censored. Entire regions are placed off-limits. And when people disappear, or when equipment malfunctions in consistent patterns, the explanations provided are often inadequate and sometimes demonstrably false. Someone knows what is really in Antarctica. Someone has access to the uncensored data, the classified reports, the full story of what explorers have found there over the past century, and that someone has decided that the rest of us do not need to know. Beyond the mysteries of what lies beneath the ice, and what governments might be hiding, Antarctica exhibits atmospheric and magnetic behaviors that challenge our understanding of physics itself. These are not conspiracy theories or explorer testimonies. These are documented scientific phenomena that remain inadequately explained. Start with the auroras. The southern lights, or aurora australis, are common in Antarctic skies, caused by solar particles interacting with the Earth's magnetic field. We understand the basic mechanism. Charged particles from the sun collide with atmospheric gases, creating spectacular light displays. This happens at both poles and is well documented. But Antarctic auroras sometimes behave differently. Research station personnel have documented aurora formations that appear without corresponding solar activity. Lights that pulse in regular patterns, rather than the random fluctuations typical of normal auroras, colors that do not match the expected spectrum produced by atmospheric gases. In 2009, researchers at Amundsen Scott South Pole Station recorded an aurora display that lasted for 17 hours straight, without interruption. The lights formed geometric patterns, repeating sequences that some observers described as almost mathematical in their precision. Attempts to correlate the display with solar wind data found no unusual solar activity during that period. The aurora appeared to be generating from within the Earth's atmosphere rather than being triggered by external particles. Several researchers present during the event later reported that their electronic equipment malfunctioned during the display. Computers crashed. Cameras stopped working. Even simple battery-operated devices drained rapidly. One scientist noted that his watch, which had kept perfect time for years, lost 3 hours during the 17-hour aurora event, as if time itself had been distorted. Then there are the atmospheric holes. Not the ozone hole, which is a separate and well-understood phenomenon, but actual gaps in the cloud cover that appear and disappear without following normal weather patterns. Satellite meteorology has captured images of circular, clear areas forming in Antarctic clouds, sometimes hundreds of miles across, remaining stable for hours or even days before vanishing. These formations occur even during storms when the atmospheric dynamics should prevent any stable, clear zones. Meteorologists have proposed various explanations involving unusual wind patterns and temperature inversions, but none of these explanations fully account for the geometric precision and stability of these atmospheric anomalies. Some of these clear zones appear directly above areas known for magnetic anomalies, suggesting a possible connection between the electromagnetic disturbances and atmospheric behavior. One theory proposes that intense magnetic fields could be affecting the ionization of atmospheric particles, creating zones where normal cloud formation is disrupted. The temperature inversions are equally strange. Antarctica should follow predictable temperature patterns. It should be coldest at the poles and gradually warmer toward the coasts. Higher elevations should be colder than lower elevations. These are basic principles of atmospheric science. Yet weather stations across Antarctica regularly record temperature readings that violate these principles. Coastal stations measuring colder temperatures than interior stations at higher elevations. Sudden spikes of warmth in the middle of winter, with no identifiable heat source. Temperature differences of 20 or 30 degrees between locations just a few miles apart, with no geographical features that would explain such variation. In 2018, an automated weather station positioned in the interior of East Antarctica recorded a temperature increase of 45 degrees over a 3-hour period. The temperature went from -60 degrees to -15 degrees, then dropped back to -60 over the next 2 hours. There was no storm, no change in wind direction, no atmospheric event that could account for such a dramatic and temporary warming. When researchers examined the data, they initially assumed equipment malfunction, but cross-referencing with satellite thermal imaging confirmed that a genuine heat spike had occurred in that location. The source of the heat was never determined. The official report classified it as an unexplained geothermal event and recommended further investigation. That investigation never happened. The atmospheric electrical activity in Antarctica is also abnormal. Lightning in snowstorms, once thought to be extremely rare, occurs with surprising frequency in certain Antarctic regions, but the lightning behaves strangely. It often appears in clear skies, with no visible storm clouds. It strikes repeatedly in the same locations, as if attracted to specific points on the ground or beneath the ice. Some researchers have documented what they call ground lights, luminous phenomena that appear at ground level, moving across the ice in patterns that suggest intelligence or purpose. These lights have been captured on video multiple times, appearing as glowing orbs or columns of light that rise from the surface and hover before vanishing or moving to a different location. Mainstream science dismisses these observations as ball lightning, plasma phenomena, or optical illusions created by ice crystals reflecting light. But the consistency of reports across different locations and different time periods suggests these explanations may be inadequate. Claudio Nocelli described unusual lighting effects beyond the ice walls, a luminescence in the clouds themselves, as if light was being generated from within the atmosphere rather than reflected from the sunday. Other explorers have reported similar observations, describing Antarctic skies that glow with their own light during the months of polar darkness. Are these atmospheric and magnetic anomalies simply unusual natural phenomena that we do not yet fully understand? Or are they symptoms of something else? Technological activity, perhaps, or energy sources operating beneath the ice that are affecting the environment above in ways we have not seen elsewhere on Earth? The instruments do not lie. The temperature spikes are real. The magnetic distortions are measurable. The atmospheric anomalies are documented. What causes them remains one of Antarctica's many unanswered questions. Sometimes the simplest explanation for secrecy is the most accurate. Money, power, resources. Antarctica may hold mysteries that challenge our understanding of history and physics, but it definitely holds something that every nation on Earth wants: wealth beyond measure locked beneath the ice. Let us talk about what we know is there. Not speculation, not conspiracy theories, but documented geological resources that have been confirmed by multiple surveys over the past 50 years. Antarctica contains some of the largest coal deposits on Earth. Thick seams of high-quality coal, easily accessible in many areas, enough to power industrial civilization for centuries. There are massive iron ore deposits in the Transantarctic Mountains, concentrated and pure, worth trillions of dollars at current market prices. Copper, gold, platinum, and rare earth minerals exist in quantities that dwarf most known deposits elsewhere on the planet. Then there is oil. Geological surveys estimate that Antarctica may contain over 200 billion barrels of oil and vast reserves of natural gas. To put that in perspective, Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, has proven reserves of about 260 billion barrels. Antarctica could potentially rival the entire Middle East in petroleum wealth. The continent also sits on massive freshwater reserves, not just the ice on the surface, which represents 70% of the world's fresh water, but also the subglacial lakes we discussed earlier. As climate change intensifies and water scarcity becomes a growing global crisis, control over Antarctica's water resources could become more valuable than oil. So here is the uncomfortable question. If Antarctica contains resources worth tens of trillions of dollars, why has no nation attempted to exploit them? Why did 54 countries agree to lock down the continent and prohibit resource extraction when the economic incentives to do otherwise are so enormous? The Antarctic Treaty's answer is environmental protection. The continent is designated as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. Mining is prohibited. Military activity is banned. It sounds noble, idealistic, a rare example of nations putting the greater good ahead of national interests. But look at the history of international relations. When has any nation voluntarily given up access to vast wealth for purely altruistic reasons? When have rival superpowers ever agreed on anything, unless it served their mutual interests? The Antarctic Treaty was negotiated during the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States could not agree on anything. They fought proxy wars across the globe. They threatened each other with nuclear annihilation. Yet somehow, they agreed that Antarctica should remain off-limits to resource exploitation and should be governed by an international system that gave both sides equal say. Why? What made Antarctica different from every other resource-rich territory on Earth? One theory is that the resources, while valuable, are simply too expensive to extract, given Antarctica's extreme environment and remote location. Mining in temperatures that regularly drop below -60 degrees, with equipment that must be transported thousands of miles across treacherous oceans, is not economically viable. By this logic, the Antarctic Treaty is less about altruism and more about pragmatism. The nations agreed not to compete for resources that nobody could profitably exploit anyway. This explanation made sense in 1959 when the treaty was signed. Technology was limited. Transportation costs were enormous. The economic calculus clearly favored leaving Antarctica untouched. But technology has advanced dramatically since then. Modern mining equipment can operate in extreme cold. Automated systems reduce the need for human workers. Transportation costs have decreased. And as easily accessible resources elsewhere on Earth become depleted, the economics of Antarctic mining become increasingly favorable. Yet the treaty remains in force. In 1998, nations even strengthened it by adopting the Protocol on Environmental Protection, which extended the mining ban indefinitely and added stricter regulations on all human activity in Antarctica. This happened at a time when resource scarcity was becoming more acute, and when nations were competing more aggressively for access to oil, minerals, and water everywhere else on Earth. So if economics cannot fully explain the Antarctic Treaty, what can? What do nations fear would happen if the continent was open to unrestricted exploration and exploitation? Some researchers suggest the answer lies not in what resources Antarctica contains, but in what might be discovered during the process of extracting those resources. If mining operations began in earnest, drilling deep into the ice and rock, excavating vast areas of the continent, what might be uncovered? Ancient structures buried beneath the ice? Evidence of civilizations that predate recorded history? Technologies that we cannot explain? Or perhaps something else? Something that powerful interests have known about for decades and have worked to keep hidden. There is another dimension to this: climate change. Antarctica is warming faster than almost any region on Earth. The ice is melting. Glaciers are retreating. In some areas, land that has been buried for thousands of years is being exposed. What will we find as the ice continues to disappear? In just the past decade, researchers have discovered meteorites, fossils, and geological features that were previously inaccessible. But there have also been reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of more unusual discoveries: artificial structures, metallic objects that show evidence of manufacturing, artifacts that do not fit into any known historical timeline. These reports are quickly classified or dismissed, but they keep appearing. A Chilean military patrol allegedly photographed geometric structures exposed by a retreating glacier in 2015. The photographs were confiscated. The patrol members were debriefed and forbidden from discussing what they had seen. A British research team reportedly discovered what appeared to be worked metal embedded in rock, dated to millions of years before humans existed. Their findings were never published. If climate change is going to expose Antarctica's secrets whether we like it or not, then the Antarctic Treaty System becomes less about preventing resource exploitation and more about controlling who gets to investigate what is being revealed and who gets to decide what information reaches the public. Consider also the geopolitical implications. Whichever nation or group of nations controls Antarctica controls access to resources that could shift the entire global balance of power. China has dramatically increased its Antarctic presence in recent years, building research stations, sending expeditions, and investing billions in polar research infrastructure. Russia has never fully withdrawn from Antarctica, maintaining a continuous presence since the Soviet era. The United States, despite budget pressures, continues to fund extensive Antarctic operations. These nations are not spending billions of dollars just to study penguins and ice cores. They are positioning themselves for the future. They are establishing claims, building infrastructure, and gathering intelligence about what Antarctica really contains. And they are doing all of this while publicly maintaining the fiction that Antarctica is an international zone dedicated to peaceful scientific research. The treaty is not preventing exploitation. It is controlling exploitation, ensuring it happens slowly, carefully, and with maximum secrecy. Nations are taking what they want from Antarctica, learning what they need to learn, but doing so in a coordinated way that prevents open conflict and keeps public attention focused elsewhere. Claudio Nocelli's discovery of land and open ocean beyond the ice walls takes on new meaning in this context. If there are habitable or resource-rich areas of Antarctica that do not appear on official maps, then the current territorial claims and treaty obligations become irrelevant. Whoever controls access to these hidden regions controls resources and possibly knowledge that exists outside the established international framework. The economic stakes alone are sufficient to explain decades of secrecy. Add in the possibility of world-changing discoveries, and you have every reason for governments to maintain the tightest possible control over who explores Antarctica, what they are allowed to investigate, and what they are permitted to reveal. Claudio Nocelli is far from alone in his claims about what lies beyond Antarctica's ice barriers. His story gains credibility not from standing in isolation, but from echoing testimonies that stretch back decades from explorers, sailors, pilots, and researchers who risked everything to tell what they had seen. In 1983, a Norwegian fishing vessel captain named Olaf Jansen gave a deathbed interview to a journalist in which he described an experience from his youth. In the early 1950s, Jansen had been part of a crew that sailed further south than their permits allowed, driven by reports from other fishermen of rich, unexploited fishing grounds beyond the ice barriers. According to Jansen, they found a passage through the ice similar to what Nocelli would describe 60 years later. On the other side, they discovered waters teeming with fish species that should not exist in Antarctic regions, warm water species. The crew spent 3 days fishing in these waters, filling their hold with a catch that would have taken weeks to accumulate in their usual grounds. When they returned and tried to sell their catch, questions were raised about where they had obtained fish species not found in authorized Antarctic fishing zones. Authorities confiscated their catch, revoked their fishing licenses, and threatened legal action if they discussed where they had actually been. Jansen never returned to Antarctic waters, but he never forgot what he had seen. That memory, he said in his final interview, had haunted him for 30 years. Then there is the account of an Australian pilot named Derek Mathers, who flew supply missions to Antarctic research stations in the late 1990s. During one flight in 1998, Mathers experienced instrument failures that forced him off his planned route. As he attempted to navigate using visual references, he flew over an area of exposed rock, and what he described as definitely not natural formations. He saw structures, he reported later, geometric patterns too regular to be geological, buildings perhaps, or the remains of buildings, partially buried in snow but clearly visible from the air. He circled the area twice, taking photographs with his personal camera, while his co-pilot tried to get the navigation systems back online. When they landed, Mathers reported the sighting to his superiors and submitted his photographs. He was told the structures were known geological formations, ice-covered rock outcrops that from certain angles could appear artificial. His photographs were never returned to him. When he requested copies for his personal records, he was informed they had been lost. Mathers later tried to relocate the area during subsequent flights, but was never able to find it again. Either he had been disoriented during the instrument failure and could not accurately remember the location, or the area was now deliberately being excluded from approved flight paths. He suspects the latter. Commercial airline pilots have also reported anomalies, though few are willing to go on record. One pilot, speaking anonymously to a researcher in 2011, described flying a charter flight over Antarctic airspace in the early 2000s. Long-range passenger jets occasionally cross the continent when flying between Australia and South America, though these routes are less common than one might expect given the fuel savings they would provide. During this particular flight, the pilot noticed an area ahead where the clouds seemed to be behaving strangely, forming a perfect circle of clear air in otherwise solid cloud cover. As they approached, all of the aircraft's electronic systems began experiencing interference. The autopilot disengaged. Navigation displays flickered. Even basic instruments like the altimeter gave contradictory readings. The pilot made the decision to alter course, steering away from the anomaly. As soon as they changed heading, the systems returned to normal. The incident was logged, and the pilot filed a report with his airline. He was later called into a meeting with airline executives and representatives from aviation authorities. They told him that he had encountered a known magnetic disturbance, that it was a natural phenomenon, and that flight paths had been adjusted to avoid the area in the future. They also made it clear that discussing the incident publicly would violate company policy and could result in the loss of his pilot's license. Even tourists have occasionally reported unusual experiences. Small-scale tourism to Antarctica has grown in recent years, with cruise ships bringing thousands of visitors to accessible coastal areas. Most see nothing unusual, just ice, penguins, and breathtaking scenery. But in 2014, a group of tourists on a zodiac excursion away from their main ship reported seeing what they described as a heat shimmer rising from the ice in an area where no geothermal activity was supposed to exist. Several members of the group took videos and photographs showing a visible distortion in the air, like the heat waves you see rising from hot pavement in summer, except this was occurring in sub-zero temperatures over solid ice. Their guide, an experienced Antarctic naturalist, had no explanation. When the group returned to the ship and tried to share their videos on social media, they found that their internet access had been restricted. Ship personnel explained it as a technical issue with the satellite connection. By the time connectivity was restored and the tourists could upload their content, their Antarctic cruise had ended. The videos did eventually appear online but received little attention. Skeptics dismissed them as camera artifacts or atmospheric effects. But the tourists themselves remained convinced they had witnessed something genuinely anomalous. What connects all these testimonies, from fishing boat captains to commercial pilots to casual tourists, is the pattern of their treatment afterward. Reports are filed and then disappeared. Evidence is confiscated or lost. People are warned not to discuss what they have seen, and if they persist, they face professional or legal consequences. These are not all conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. These are working professionals with reputations to protect and little obvious incentive to fabricate stories. Yet they keep coming forward, adding their voices to a chorus that spans decades and continents, all saying essentially the same thing. There is more to Antarctica than we are being told, and someone is working very hard to make sure that message does not spread. We have spent considerable time exploring the mysteries, the testimonies, and the anomalies surrounding Antarctica. But if we are going to be honest investigators rather than just conspiracy enthusiasts, we need to examine the counterarguments. What does mainstream science say about these claims? And where are the weaknesses in the alternative theories we have been discussing? Let us start with Claudio Nocelli's central claim that he sailed through an ice wall and found open ocean and land on the other side. The scientific explanation for what he experienced is straightforward. Antarctica is surrounded by ice shelves that extend out from the continental landmass. These ice shelves have edges that can indeed appear as vertical walls rising from the ocean. Channels and passages through these ice shelves form naturally as ice flows and breaks apart. When Nocelli sailed through what he described as a narrow channel, he was most likely navigating through one of these natural gaps in the ice shelf. And when he emerged into open water on the other side, he was probably in a polynya, an area of open water surrounded by ice that forms when ocean currents and wind patterns prevent ice from forming or cause existing ice to break up and drift away. Polynyas are well-documented phenomena. They can be quite large, covering thousands of square miles. They can persist for weeks or months, and they occur in areas that, on most maps, appear to be solid ice because the maps show average conditions rather than real-time ice coverage. The warmer water temperatures Nocelli recorded? Also explainable. Ocean currents bring relatively warm water from lower latitudes deep beneath the Antarctic surface ice. Where these currents upwell, or where they encounter underwater geological features, they can create zones of water that are significantly warmer than surrounding areas. Temperature differences of 15 to 20 degrees between different water masses in the Antarctic region are not unusual. The wildlife Nocelli observed, species that seemed too temperate for Antarctic waters. Marine life is more adaptable than we often give it credit for. Many species have wider ranges than we fully understand. And during Antarctic summer months, migratory birds and marine mammals from more temperate regions do venture into Antarctic waters when conditions allow. As for the land masses Nocelli claims to have seen, the most likely explanation is that he was observing islands or coastal features that do exist but that he misidentified due to distance, atmospheric conditions, or navigational errors caused by the magnetic anomalies he was experiencing. Antarctica does have areas of exposed rock and even small ice-free zones, particularly during summer months. These are rare but not unknown. So by conventional scientific reasoning, everything Nocelli experienced can be explained without resorting to hidden continents or suppressed geographical knowledge. He sailed through an ice shelf, entered Apollonia, encountered some unusual but not impossible oceanographic conditions, and possibly caught glimpses of known, but rarely visited coastal features that he could not accurately position due to magnetic interference with his instruments. This explanation is not only plausible, it is actually the most probable explanation given what we know about Antarctic geography and oceanography. Now let us apply the same critical analysis to Admiral Byrd and Operation Highjump. The official record states that the operation was terminated early due to the approaching Antarctic winter and the increasing danger that posed to personnel and equipment. This is entirely reasonable. Antarctic weather becomes dramatically more severe as winter approaches, and continuing operations past a certain point would have been genuinely dangerous. The casualties and equipment losses that occurred during Operation Highjump are documented, but they are not particularly unusual for such a large-scale operation in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Accidents happen, equipment fails, people die. It is tragic, but it does not require a conspiracy to explain. As for Byrd's statements about discovering lands of eternal mystery and the need to defend against enemy aircraft, these comments need to be understood in their historical context. Byrd was giving interviews in 1947, at the beginning of the Cold War, when tensions with the Soviet Union were escalating rapidly. His comments about enemy aircraft and pole-to-pole threats were likely referring to the very real possibility of Soviet bombers using polar routes to attack the United States. This was a genuine strategic concern at the time. The controversial diary describing encounters with advanced civilizations. As we mentioned earlier, this diary has never been authenticated. The writing style does not match Byrd's verified journals. The content mirrors science fiction themes that were popular in the 1950s and 60s when the diary allegedly surfaced. The most likely explanation is that it is a fabrication, created either as a hoax or as a sincere but misguided attempt to preserve what someone believed was secret knowledge. What about the ancient maps showing ice-free Antarctica? This is where the scientific counterarguments are strongest. The Piri Reis map and similar historical maps have been extensively analysed by cartographers and historians. While they do show southern landmasses that bear some resemblance to Antarctica, they also contain numerous inaccuracies and features that do not match Antarctic geography at all. The scholarly consensus is that these maps are compilations of imperfect geographical knowledge, folklore, and speculation about what might exist in unexplored regions of the world. Cartographers of that era knew there had to be land masses in the southern hemisphere to balance the continents in the north, and they drew speculative land masses based on that assumption. That some of these speculative drawings happened to roughly approximate the actual location and shape of Antarctica is more coincidence than evidence of lost ancient knowledge. The Air Force analysis that Charles Hapgood obtained, suggesting the maps showed Antarctica before it was covered by ice, has been challenged by later researchers. Modern cartographic analysis using computer modeling has shown that the Piri-Reis map can be adequately explained as a distorted projection of known geography from that era, primarily the coast of South America, without requiring any knowledge of Antarctica. The underground cavern systems and subglacial lakes beneath Antarctica are real, but their existence does not prove the existence of habitable spaces or hidden civilizations. These are natural geological features formed by volcanic heat and the pressure of overlying ice. While they may harbor microbial life, there is no credible evidence suggesting they contain complex ecosystems or anything remotely resembling human habitation. The government suppression angle is perhaps the hardest to evaluate objectively. Yes, there are classified documents about Antarctica. Yes, satellite imagery has gaps and quality issues. Yes, the Antarctic Treaty restricts access to certain areas. But all of this can be explained by legitimate national security concerns, international political agreements designed to prevent conflict, and the simple fact that Antarctica is remote, expensive to image with high resolution, and not a priority for most satellite operators. The testimonies from various explorers, pilots, and researchers are intriguing, but testimonies alone are not sufficient evidence. Human perception is fallible, memory is unreliable. People misinterpret what they see, especially in extreme environments where atmospheric conditions can create powerful optical illusions. And some people do fabricate stories for attention, even when they have seemingly little to gain from doing so. So where does this leave us? If we apply strict scientific skepticism, most of the Antarctic mysteries can be explained through conventional means. Natural phenomena, human error, misinterpretation of data, and the occasional hoax or exaggeration can account for the vast majority of unusual claims. But here is the thing about strict scientific skepticism. It can also be used to dismiss legitimate anomalies. Science has a long history of rejecting evidence that does not fit established paradigms, only to later accept that evidence once it becomes overwhelming. Continental drift was ridiculed for decades before it was accepted. The existence of meteorites was denied by the scientific establishment well into the 1800s. Ball lightning was considered folklore until it was finally captured on high-speed cameras. So while we should absolutely examine claims critically and demand evidence, we should also remain open to the possibility that our current understanding of Antarctica is incomplete. The continent is vast, largely unexplored, and possesses environmental conditions that can produce phenomena we do not yet fully understand. The question is not whether mainstream science can explain the Antarctic mysteries. It can, at least in a general way. The question is whether those explanations are complete, whether they account for all the evidence, and whether the dismissal of alternative theories is based on genuine scientific reasoning or on institutional resistance to ideas that challenge established narratives. That is a question each person has to answer for themselves based on how they weigh the evidence we have presented. We have journeyed deep into one of the most controversial mysteries on Earth, and we are not done yet. But this is a good moment to pause and ask yourself something. How many documentaries have you watched that actually encourage you to think critically, to question both the mainstream narrative and the alternative theories, to do your own research rather than just accept what you are told? That is what we do here. We investigate the mysteries they do not want you asking about, but we also give you the tools to investigate for yourself. If you value that approach, if you want to be part of a community that seeks truth rather than just entertainment, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And here is something you can actually do. Antarctica is not completely off limits. There are legitimate tour companies that operate cruises to accessible areas of the continent. Some research programs accept civilian volunteers. The information is out there if you look for it. Do not just watch videos about mysteries. Consider actually exploring them. The world needs more people willing to see things for themselves, rather than relying on what governments and institutions tell them is true. Now, let us bring this all together and talk about what Antarctica really means for humanity's past, present, and future. So what does it all mean? Whether Claudio Nocelli discovered hidden lands or simply misinterpreted natural phenomena, whether Admiral Byrd encountered advanced civilizations or experienced cold-induced hallucinations, Whether ancient maps show lost knowledge or cartographic guesswork, one truth remains undeniable. Antarctica is not what we have been told it is. The continent holds secrets. Some of those secrets are scientific, waiting to be discovered through legitimate research. Others may be historical, evidence of human activity, or natural events that challenge our understanding of the past. And some, if the testimonies we have examined hold any truth, may be actively suppressed by governments and institutions that have decided the public does not need to know. What should we take away from Claudio Nocelli's story and the countless others like it? Not blind belief, but informed skepticism. Not conspiracy thinking, but critical thinking. The willingness to question official narratives, while also demanding evidence for alternative claims. Nocelli's current situation tells its own story. After returning from his voyage and attempting to share his findings, his professional life was systematically dismantled. He lost contracts, faced legal challenges, and was essentially blacklisted from the maritime industry where he had spent 3 decades building an impeccable reputation. Today, he continues to speak about his experience to anyone willing to listen, maintaining that what he saw was real, that the coordinates he recorded are accurate, and that anyone with the means and courage can verify his claims by following the route he documented. No one has publicly done so, or if they have not shared their findings. That, perhaps, is the real mystery. In an age where private individuals have the resources to launch rockets into space, where adventurers regularly attempt to be the first to climb unscaled peaks or cross unexplored jungles, why has no one with significant resources attempted to verify Nocelli's voyage? Why has no billionaire adventurer decided to mount an expedition to sail through the ice walls and document what lies beyond? The answer might be as simple as lack of interest, or it might be that those with the means to undertake such expeditions understand there are consequences to discovering certain truths. What we know for certain is this: Antarctica is the last truly mysterious place on Earth. It is a continent larger than Europe, 98% covered by ice, with an interior that remains almost completely unexplored. It contains resources worth trillions of dollars, geological features we are only beginning to understand, and environmental conditions that can produce phenomena we cannot fully explain. It is protected by an international treaty system that, while officially about environmental preservation and scientific cooperation, also serves to tightly control who explores what and when. Information about Antarctica is filtered, managed, and when necessary, classified. The explorers who venture beyond approved boundaries, whether physical boundaries like ice walls or informational boundaries like asking uncomfortable questions, face professional and sometimes legal consequences. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. So here is my challenge to you. Do not just accept what I have told you in this documentary. Do not accept what mainstream science tells you either. Look at the evidence yourself. Read the declassified documents. Study the maps. Listen to the testimonies. Apply critical thinking to both the official narrative and the alternative theories. And if you find inconsistencies, if you discover information that does not add up, if you encounter evidence that something is being hidden, do not stay silent. Share what you find. Ask questions. Demand transparency. The truth about Antarctica matters because it connects to larger questions about how information is controlled in our society, about what we are told versus what is real, about the nature of our planet and our history. If they are willing to hide the truth about an entire continent, what else are they hiding? Tell me in the comments right now. Do you believe Claudio Nocelli? Do you think there are hidden lands beyond Antarctica's ice walls? Do you believe governments are suppressing information about what really exists there? And most importantly, what would you do if you had the resources to mount your own expedition? Would you have the courage to sail into forbidden waters and risk everything to discover the truth? This investigation is not over. As long as Antarctica remains mysterious, as long as questions remain unanswered, we will continue exploring, questioning, and seeking the truth. Because the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is worth pursuing. The truth is out there, beyond the ice walls, beneath the frozen surface, hidden in classified documents and suppressed testimonies. And you deserve to know it. Subscribe, stay curious, and never stop asking questions. This is Mr. H, and I will see you in the next investigation.